I come to ask you to help to win this fight. If we win it, this hardest of all fights, then, to be sure, in the future it is going to be made easier for women all over the world to win their fight when their time comes.
I have a slide which has impossible on it with the "im" crossed off. I believe anything is possible, but you've got to be willing to be agile, and it is doable. But it's also something we're going to have to fight for. It's not going to come to us easily.
Women's football has an incredible momentum behind it. I'd like to think that by 2040, 2050, women's football and women's sport is at the same level as men's football.
In order for change to happen, there needs to be a sense of urgency. And I think our report can also convey some of that sense of urgency of things heading into the wrong direction.
That was Sue Campbell, till recently Director of Women's Football at the FA, Alex von SCHIRMEISTER, UK Managing Director at Xero, one of the biggest and broadest sponsors of women's football, and Julian HADWIGER at the WHU-OTTO BEISHEIM School of Management, author of one of the most authoritative reports on women's football of recent years. I'm Charlie Dobre, and this final episode of Not Small Men looks at the future of women's football in England. It's bright, isn't it? Deloitte have recently reported that the combined revenues of Europe's top 15 women's teams have risen 35% in 1 year to €117 million, and 8 are WSL sides. UEFA have announced bigger prize money for the Champions League and a new second-tier competition too. 23-24 WSL attendances were up 41% on the previous season. A new BBC Sky TV deal is now worth £13 million per season. And we've recently seen the first ever $1 million transfer fee for a player paid by Chelsea for Naomi Girma. Yet, when Julian says things are going in the wrong direction, I find myself agreeing. In fact, that's why I wanted to make this series in the first place. I've witnessed and played a small part in the development of the women's game since 2010. There's been a lot of progress in that time, but in some areas that progress has been very slow. Revenues have grown, but when we look at the key indicators I touched on before, what do they all have in common? They tell a story of a small number of big teams experiencing significant growth, boosted by subsidies from the parent club. The story for the majority of women's teams, however, is much more hand-to-mouth, progress more challenging and slower. Already, the domination of certain men's clubs is becoming the reality in the women's game. So, the concern is that the opportunity, the space for a new model in women's football is fading as the old men's model rolls over everything and calls the shots. Of course, the answer isn't to hold back these clubs. It's really about how the whole game can be grown at the same time.
When you look at the teams in the Champions League, you want them to do well. You can't control what somebody in Spain or France or Germany or whatever invests in their women's teams. So you've got to allow our top teams and the best teams to be in the best position to do well in Europe. Because if you don't do that, then the talent will just go to the other countries. Or if you want those teams to be successful and you want the commercial revenue to come in, there have got to be brands in the league. There's got to be. You can't get away from that. That is what drives the commercial aspect in the league.
Lee Saunders, who runs Durham Women, sees the positive aspect of the growth of the big clubs, but like many, he questions the share of the pie that they receive.
I think it's more, well, everybody goes, right, we don't want to be like the men's game. That's absolutely, we don't want to be like the men's game. But a lot of the decisions that we make leans towards, oh, well, actually, we want to be the same as the men's game. We just say we don't. And as I said, it's brilliant. The clubs are investing. But then you also go, if you want to bring things closer together, if you want that jeopardy, if you want to create more of that competition, when we make strategic decisions around the 75-25 split, for example, is that right? It probably isn't. I understand why the clubs say it should be that way, because they're driving that revenue into the league. So there's no real right answer and wrong answer in the whole thing, if I'm being honest. It's just if everybody practices what they preach and does, oh, we want to bring things closer together, we want to bridge that gap, then that wasn't a very clever decision.
Women's football will grow. It will be big. We can kind of stop saying that now. The question is, how big will this pie be? I think there is a very real risk that so much of the revenues going to so few teams so soon will backfire big time on those teams, on everyone. Why? Because I think the pie is potentially not big. I think it's absolutely huge, but it won't be the same recipe as those soggy pies you get at most men's matches in England.
Do I believe all of the clubs think like I do? No, I don't. I'm afraid they have a model, which is the men's model, where commercial value is what it's all about. It's not about player development. It's not about what's right for men or for women. It's about income. It's about, it is about success, because success generates your money. But I'm not sure it's about a real passionate commitment to the women's game. Now, I'm sure some of those big clubs would argue with me and say, but we've invested in the women's game for years, and they have. But when you try to collect them together to create a collaborative way forward, they split off again, because actually they want their way forward. They don't want a collaborative way forward. And in my view, for the women's game to thrive, survive, and move on to a different platform, it needs to be a collaborative approach across the whole game, and it needs to be a collaborative approach across clubs. That's a different approach to the one they're used to, and it's hard.
What if what's right is also what drives the biggest commercial value in the women's game? What if, in the purpose-driven women's game, right and commercial are the same thing, and what we're really talking about is the pace of development and how it's harnessed? Here's former player ELLIE LEEK and Jenny HASKEL from Deloitte.
I think investment has probably happened too quickly in an unsustainable way to where clubs can't afford it anymore. It's almost like the more investment that's put up this end, it's like crippling the teams down this end. So this is great, you guys are getting better, but these teams can't keep up. So the disparity in the league gets even bigger. These teams win everything. These teams lose everything. Becomes boring, right? Nobody's going to watch that.
The growth of all different clubs across the country, across the league, isn't going to happen at the same time. While we're going to see, different resources be able to drive revenues and drive opportunity across different clubs, it is important to recognize that we're going to either see a rising tide lift all boats, or we're going to start to see new and innovative ways in different clubs that are going to have to transition their business model to be able to optimize this growth.
Think about it. The prize here is huge. In England and Wales, 84% of football fans are men, and 80% are over 35 years old. That's according to a 2023 survey by the FSA Football Supporters Association. It's been 150 years, and still football is a product that largely doesn't interest women, and I think marginalised sections of society too. Is that changing for men's football? Yes, a bit. But meanwhile, there is now stacks of evidence that women's football audiences over-index on, wait for it, women, young people and marginalised groups in society. Wow. But if the early revenues raised go to just a handful of super teams, the development may be fast, but also very narrow, and a monument to inequality and short-termism, like a skyscraper in a village. If you buy the idea of just how big and broad the women's game can be, then like me, you'll be wondering what the barriers are to this win-win future. So I asked my guests their thoughts, and their answers fell into 6 categories: on-pitch competitiveness, league structure, governance, player voice, investment and pace of development. Here's Moya Dodd, Secretary to the Board of the Women's League Forum, and also Jenny HASKEL of Deloitte again.
So I think as we develop women's football, the strength and the solidarity of those national leagues is really crucial. The ability of the lowest ranked team, the bottom team in those leagues, to go out and give it a red hot go against the top team in that league, if that's still a game, then, that's a very good thing. because you'll have competitive intensity. And we all know that, without resistance, you don't improve. It's like lifting weights in the gym. Unless you're lifting weights that are going to put you out of your comfort zone and create resistance, then you're not really going to get any stronger. And it's likewise for players. If they've got a game that lasts for 10 minutes and it's all over because you're already 4-0 up, then they're not going to improve much from a game like that.
I think right now, as you continue to build across the system as well, the competitive environment is going to be really important to engaging fans across the board. That keeps fans at the edge of their seat, game in, game out. So when you think across the broader landscape of women's sport, do you have, the governance principles set up for success? Do you have, the regulations set up that will ensure financial sustainability across the league so that you can optimize the competitive performance on the pitch? And I think that's something that we're starting to see implemented right now and hopefully will pay dividends come the next few years, where we start to see top to bottom, you never know who's going to win and what the outcome will be. And I think that's really important to keeping fans engaged for the long run.
Football finance expert Kieron O'Connor warns of a specific and significant threat to the growth of the game if competitive imbalance is not addressed.
You do want to ensure that clubs have enough of a budget to attract the best talent, so the WSL as a whole is a good product, for want of a better word. But at the same time, you want to sort of maintain that sort of competitive balance. So I don't pretend that that's an easy thing to do. It absolutely isn't. But it's certainly something that people might want to look at. Because I think that the risk with competitive imbalance is higher in the women's game. Because if clubs feel that they're just too far behind to compete, they might just give up and say, well, we're not going to fund a women's team anymore, which they're unlikely to do on the men's side. They might sort of grumble, but they're not going to take such draconian action.
As we saw in episode 4, throughout the world, we generally see certain teams absolutely dominating their league. Sue Campbell is a hugely respected figure in the women's game and was, till recently, Director of Women's Football at the FA. Even in the midst of great success in women's football in England, she still warns about the head leaving the body.
I believe development needs to be holistic. And what I mean by it is, if you move any part of the game too quickly, you'll detach it from the rest. The moment you detach it, you begin to create because our whole system is not that mature yet. It's an immature, quite vulnerable system. So yes, we've got more girls playing. Yes, we've doubled the number of coaches working in the women's game. Yes, we've increased the number of referees. Yes, we've redesigned the talent pathway. But we don't have the funding for the talent pathway that we need. It's minor. So if what I mean is, if you let the rich people and the Premier League clubs are rich in clubs, if you let them take that top away, do you take the head off the body? In other words, does the body start to think he can't get? I want any girl who is sitting in a primary school anywhere in this country, who has the desire, has the talent, is prepared to put in the work, prepared to sacrifice things you have to sacrifice to be the best. I don't want her to look at the top and go, but I can't get there. What would be the point of that? It takes away the whole essence of a healthy system. So I don't want the head to leave the body.
Competitiveness and an open promotion-relegation league structure are vital for the long-term health of the game. Lee Sanders at Durham Women is among many who think that just the one promotion spot into the WSL is not enough anymore.
I would say you borderline have to have about a 90% success record in the Championship now if you want to get promoted. It's that competitive for a start. There's only one place for promotion. All that takes is a bad day. That's not 5. That's not like in the men's league where you can have half a dozen off days. You might only get 1, 2 off days, and then that's it. It's finished. You may not ever retrieve what you've lost on that day because there's so few games. And as I say, because there's only one space to go up, I think the amount of times, even ourselves over the years when we've finished second, third, things like that, teams who have gone up ahead of us have been generally the teams that have just ploughed a lot of money in that year.
Natalie Burrell speaks for many fans when she too expresses a desire for a bigger WSL.
WSL is like 12 teams. There should be. I don't want to push people before they can. Maybe it wasn't right, but I do think there is a period, maybe last year or the year before, where they could have made it a bit bigger and had a bit more, jeopardy at the bottom to make the league more exciting. And, for me, that would have brought in more people, would have encouraged more teams to bid if there was more than one going up. Look at someone like West Ham. I think they're doing well, but, they can just tread water. They don't have to put in extra money. That's a big men's team. They've got a nice new stadium. They could be where Arsenal are, you know what I mean? But they don't have to, because they don't have to put in money, because someone's going to go down. Who's come up now? Palace are probably going to go down. As long as they spend 100k, a couple of 100k more than Palace, that's it. There's no kind of jeopardy or fight or push to make any of these teams do any better. And then I look at someone like, I'm trying to think, who was in and around. Well, Durham are always in and around, and they're not a Premier League men's team, but they've been finishing second. And there was the period where if you had put Durham up there, maybe they would have just come back down. And yeah, it would have been too quick for them, but give them the chance, let them do it.
Lee Saunders voices the frustration of many teams outside the WSL.
I think we find a lot of excuses not to do it instead of reasons to do it. Because at some point the leagues have got to grow. We'll play 20 league games this season with Reading, unfortunately, more than the league. That's not great. The players now, by the time the season ends and starts up again, potentially will have been paid and not worked, kicked the ball, trained or whatever for 2 to 3 months. It's getting to a point where, do we actually want to expand? Do we want more teams involved? Because a lot of the decisions that we make, and I understand why some of them are made, it's things like the revenue. If you bring an extra two teams into the championship, for example, you're not splitting that revenue between 12 teams, you're splitting it between 14, so you get less. But I think at some point the clubs have almost got to say, okay, we might have to accept that, because the longer term, we think the people at the top of Newcourt are going to bring in very, very lucrative commercial deals. So actually, that should even itself back out again, and actually having more teams in the league increase more interest. And if we can get to a point where we've got playoffs, it increases the jeopardy, so that increases, it can be all positive, but at some point we've got to take the leap and go, we have to expand.
UEFA has recently announced bigger prize money for teams in the Women's Champions League, plus a new second-tier competition. One knock-on effect of that could be for WSL teams, who will be the beneficiaries of UEFA's move to reduce their 75% take of central funding, leaving more of that money to pay for league expansion. Bigger leagues might be right for England, but it's not necessarily the right approach in every country. In France, Roland Giscard d'Estaing imagines a very different evolution.
Yeah. If I'm in charge in France, I'll create a shorter league with the best of the best, and I'll create a smaller league with probably 6 to 8 teams with a full with an academy, so a super league, a first division, and second division. The Super League is well funded with a contract with a media, a contract for 5 years. Funding, reduced in terms of the timing. You'll probably do it for 2 months at the best time of the year. 2 months, 6 to 8 team max. Minimum guarantee to participate, provided by sponsors and media rights, and it's a top quality level. You give the media an amazing platform, an amazing show.
One concern I heard from a number of my interviewees was, you may be surprised to hear, the pace of development. That the speed might suit the clubs at the top of the game and their players, but not everyone else, the majority of clubs and players. Here's Paul Dreisbach, who works in women's football development across the world.
It's moving so fast. I'm afraid that the bottom might fall out at some point. because there's so much going in at the top, so much investment, so much media. It reminds me a little bit of some of the rise of different leagues. And a few years on, the bottom falls out of it. Like there's been many league startups and failures in the States over the years, you know, on the men's and women's side. And the NWSL, for example, and the new USL League, they seem to have a good strategy, some really good people involved in that. Building it from the top down a bit is one approach, and that's fine as long as you consider everything. But I'm a little worried the development built underneath it isn't gonna make it last. There's not a foundation. It's all up top right now, and people are just hoping that it works, which it might. And there's a lot of great things happening, but I'm thinking like 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road, where are players going to come from? Who's investing in that pipeline to make sure that it's sustainable, it's done right, it's treating people well? So, I mean, there's a lot to that conversation too about what's built underneath it all and where the investment's going. But I could see that be one main difference in where the women's game goes is how they build the complete cycle and treat it equally throughout. Because right now it's all going to the top.
Helen Ward, former player and now general manager at Watford Women, sums up what many other contributors said.
I think what needs to be really considered is that we want to have the highest expectations possible of all the teams. But if those expectation levels are set too high, then the gap is unclosable. So I'll give Nuco as an example. They've set down a few new rules and regs ahead of the next couple of seasons, and licensing requirements, most of which are obtainable for those in the positions that need to obtain them, but some of which are not. And I think we have to be really careful not to set those expectations too high too soon for everyone. Yes, your Man Cities, your Arsenals, your Chelseas can knock them out the park, no problem. But the Readings of the world, who have been really big players in the women's game for a number of years and built themselves up the right way through the levels, competed in the top level for a number of years and pretty well for the size of their club, all of a sudden, end of the season comes round, really sorry, we can't meet those regulations. And Reading's maybe not the best example because there's all sorts of different things going on at that club as a whole. But it's just an example of if you change and up those expectations too quickly, there will be a fallout. And okay, you might be able to say, all right, well, we can sacrifice one club. But when that becomes 2, 3, 4 clubs that can't then meet it, then that gap becomes too broad and it never becomes bridgeable. You can't get to that stage in women's football. It wouldn't do enough to have 8 top teams and nobody else. It doesn't become a product for me.
Licenses in women's football have become a contentious issue for some clubs, particularly those who don't have access to capital on tap. Bloomberg recently reported that WSL licenses may soon require clubs to spend at least £650,000 a year on salaries for their women's teams alone. Each iteration of the licenses for the WSL Championship and now the National League too calls for increasing expenditure on a range of mandated facilities. There is now open talk of clubs either not being able to afford a licence or opting out of women's football as costs expand faster than revenues. No one is arguing that the mandated expenditures won't create better environments for players and fans, but they are saying you're in danger of putting pro-women's football beyond the means of all but the usual group of elite men's clubs. I wonder if it's time for licenses to have a common-sense link to club turnover, where there is a base level of requirements for all clubs, but then a series of additional asks that are triggered as turnover increases, which would build in sustainable budgets and enable longer-term planning. If a club can have happy, safe players in a stadium that only has a 5,000 capacity and happy, safe fans, all within a sustainable budget, what's not to like? That might make them a small team in the WSL or Championship or National League, but they may still be able to compete on the pitch, or at least deserve to. For the handful of clubs who can already invest many millions in their women's teams, you can understand why they would want to drive development in a way that will enable them to recoup their investment in the not-too-distant future. But their views carry enormous weight on the committees that led to the establishment of NUCO, or WPLL as it's currently known, and they seem to be guiding the path and speed of development of the game for everyone. There are no bad guys here. We do, though, need to ask ourselves if we are content with them driving the game in ways which can be detrimental to the whole game. Jenny Haskell at Deloitte sees time pressures across women's sport generally.
I think we put a lot of pressure on women's sport and some of these leagues to really succeed really, really quickly. Whereas in many other industries, it takes a lot of years. It takes a lot of, whether that be funding rounds, et cetera, to really get, hold of an incredible pace of growth. And I think we're starting to see that growth a little bit faster within women's sport and the expectation of revenues to follow. And so I think we'll start to see that as you start to look at different investment models, different commercial models, et cetera, we'll start to see a bit of diversification of that across the league. And hopefully will bring up attendances, revenues, et cetera, across the board.
No one I've spoken to wants to somehow stop the big clubs making the revenues they need to grow their club. The questions I hear are about finding the way for all clubs for the whole game to grow as one. Clubs, understandably, don't like edicts from the top that may curb their own growth, but all clubs want to feel genuinely involved in the way forward, to be fully heard and listened to.
Many of these changes that we've seen in men's football feel imposed upon by people in the ivory tower. And I think especially in women's football, which really thrives off of this approachability, off of this positivity, we really need to be careful to not make the same mistakes.
I was on the board at Lewes Football Club till 2022, and in that time, a number of consultations were conducted about various aspects of the women's game. This included video calls for groups of general managers or commercial managers. There were committees where you could voice ideas and concerns. Largely, the consultation involved a one-to-one between a club rep and an FA rep. It goes without saying there was a genuine intent to gather views, but I always felt that the real discussions and the voices that ultimately decided things were happening somewhere else. This is a really common form of consultation, but it invariably has little or no space for a key dynamic. I wanted to have face-to-face, large gatherings of every kind of stakeholder at every level, and for the really big questions to be asked, beyond tactics, beyond strategy even, instead debating the very essence and aims of women's football in England. Because without that, exactly where is the journey heading? And how will you know when you've got there?
In order to answer the question, how should you set this up, you really first need to answer what do you want to be and how do you want to position yourself. And only then you can answer how do we want to structure the game and how do we want to structure ownership? Do we want to invite investors and so on? So it's about finding your strategic North Star and then figuring out the structure in accordance to this strategy.
I like how Julian Hadwiger puts it. What is the North Star for women's football in England? Each country will have its own North Star. Here's Sue Campbell again.
How do you resource and finance this so that it can be a new model for excellence, not a replica of what we've seen before? Because if, we want this to be something that transforms women's football. We want this to be something that puts a stake in the ground about equity for women. Not just in football, but in society as a whole. I think football is such a powerful vehicle to establish wider societal shift. But, how much do you compromise to get where you want to, and how much do you have to hold the line and maybe not get where you want to right now because you just don't want to give away too much? It's hard. This is hard stuff. This is not easy stuff.
What should this new model be? I think the views of the traditional big clubs on this need to be heard. They have a very informed perspective. They've already put money on the table. But the table wasn't built by them alone. It was built over decades by so many clubs at every level, by generations of players, by countless administrators. So many people have spent so many hours to get the women's game where it is today. Is it not right and also smart that all views are heard and debated and that none carry excessive weight? Here's former player Ellie Leek.
People just have to listen to the players and the coaching staff and the people that have lived through women's football through the years, like the people who Like I've sacrificed my entire life for women's football, and I never seen the good side of it. And there's a lot of players who have done that, and like listen to those players.
Perhaps the PFA can speak for those professional players they represent, but there are far more semi-pro and amateur players who live a very different football experience to those pro players. And the staff at so many clubs are absolutely overrun and exhausted by all the things they're expected to do, often for not much pay. They need a voice too in this new model. So let me float an idea. There is a form of consultation of dialogue that is designed to not only hear all voices, but to also synthesize those voices to create a singular destination for all. Citizens' assemblies. Governments around the world use this approach to help them develop policy in complex areas. An assembly has 3 phases: learning, deliberation, and decision-making. It ends with a set of specific recommendations to the governing body, in this case the FA, who are then tasked with implementation or, if a recommendation is rejected, explaining why. So many people have a legitimate stake in the women's game. The process I'm describing is one which is fully explained on the Institute for Government website. It is one which could never happen now in the men's game. That ship has sailed. But in the women's game, it isn't too late. We're still building the ship, and if we want it to be one that has never been seen before, and on which we'd all feel proud to sail, then give the Citizens' Assembly idea some thought. Of course, wherever we want the journey to go, it's going to take money to get there. Lots of it. At the moment, the investment environment in women's football is very patchy, unsurprisingly for such a new market. Perhaps a central growth strategy and target created in assemblies that therefore has the whole game's backing could coalesce investment, like a government industrial plan does for the country. It creates a long-term stable growth environment that investors can believe in. For me, this is a better method than just cutting out relegation, say, to create stability. Investment is coming into the women's game, but you couldn't say it's flooding in yet, again, with a probable exception of the US. Here's Jenny Haskell again.
I think the States is a really interesting market right now when it comes to valuations, but also when it comes to revenues and sponsorship. You know, you're in one of the biggest sports markets in the entire world, and that definitely plays a role in it. But I think as we start to see women's sports, and not necessarily just football, but also basketball, volleyball, softball, etc., we're starting to see a lot of new trends within this industry. So, you know, when we were taking a look as Deloitte, investment in women's sport come this year and next year, we were looking at a different investor profile. So a more institutional investment, high net worth individuals, conglomerates, etc. And I think we're starting to see that materialize, that across these women's sports league, we're not only seeing, you know, the previous kind of structured set of investors, but we're also seeing athlete investors. We're seeing high net worth individuals. We're seeing new owners that haven't previously been either interested or invested in sport. And that plays a big role. But I think the other thing that is really starting to take note within women's sport that I think is actually a broader trend as well is we're starting to see kind of these high profile individuals. So whether that be celebrities or big commercial names that are now acting as an owner, but also helping to supercharge the commercial appeal of these teams because of the platforms that they have.
The money is out there, but outside the States, deals are sporadic at best. Of course, Michelle Kang's Kiniska Group has now invested in the English game too at London City Lionesses, and it's worthwhile noting that the 2 independent women's teams in the Championship who received investment, London City and Durham, having been in a relegation fight the previous season, the following season find themselves now both as genuine promotion contenders to the WSL. Investment works. But independent clubs aside, there is a specific structural barrier to investment.
I think it's interesting. I think, you know, when you think about the UK and the initial phase that it's in terms of investment, you know, right now the structure isn't necessarily set up for external investors or other investors to come in just to the women's team. We might see that happen more often in the next few years. But as of right now, I think the big thing is recognizing the delineation and the attribution of different assets towards the women's teams, or separating those different assets and the revenues to the women's teams across the English leagues. I think one of the things over the past year that we've seen, obviously, with Michelle Kang coming in at the London City Lionesses as part of her multi-club ownership model, we're starting to see kind of that greater recognition of what is different and what is needed within the women's game. And that's not going to happen with one transaction. That's not going to happen with one investor. But we're going to start to see what I kind of think we're looking at is almost this test and learn model. What does women's football need in different markets? How can you supercharge the growth of it? You might try something, it might not work. You might try something else, and great, it works. And we continue to move on from there. I think it's so, it's nascent in its growth phase right now, but it's also showing great return. So how do we optimize that with different investment, but how do we optimize that with different commercial models, different match day models? I don't think it's a copy and paste of what's happening in the United States or what's happening in North America.
The reality is that almost all teams operating in the top 4 divisions of women's football in England are part of a bigger men's club. Will that club be willing to sell an equity stake in their women's team? A majority? A minority? Are they able to restructure to enable it? If an investor bought a minority stake, what intellectual property, what part of the brand would it get rights to? Could it set its own course, even if that was somehow at odds with the men's club? These questions are not insurmountable, but they mean that as things stand, men's club-owned women's teams are not, you might say, oven ready. It's been reported that Chelsea are looking at offering some kind of stake in their women's team. If this happens and goes well for seller and buyer, then a new investment front may well open up. But as I've mentioned, the challenges are not purely equity-based. They are also about any buyer's freedom to market the women's team how they wish. Some clubs may look to increasingly separate their women's teams out, irrespective of new investment. Here's Kieron O'Connor again.
People will be looking at what Chelsea are doing with a great deal of interest, which is effectively setting up a separate company within the group. I don't necessarily think that means that they would sell the whole women's club. In fact, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't mean that. But what it's likely to mean is that people would sell a slice of the action. So, and we've seen that again in the men's game. You see FSG at Liverpool have sold minor stakes. Even City Football Club have done the same. So I think that would be a way of getting investment. So the 2 steps would be, 1, separate the company in the group structure. So you don't have to invest via the men's organisation. You're investing specifically in the women's team. And second, investors recognising that they don't necessarily have to buy the whole thing. They can just take a share. So I think that is probably a fairly likely trend.
We are also seeing the beginnings of something which is very common now in the men's game, multi-club ownership, or MCOs.
If you look at some of the interesting work that's being done by the likes of Michelle Kang and her concept of multi-club ownership, so within her stable, she's acquired London City Lionesses, which is a club that, with your Lewis background, you'll know quite well. I mean, it's not a huge club by any shape or means, but she's already attracted the Swedish captain, Kosovare Islani, and the manager from PSG, Jocelyn Prescourt. And PSG were in the Champions League semi-finals not so long ago. So it's I think that sort of shows the art of the possible, and comes back to your point about this real willingness and forward momentum and direction, and is one way, I think, of boosting the women's game. I mean, I think multi-club ownership, when I've looked at it in the men's game, there are risks and dangers inherent in that. But I think in the women's game, and the women's game doesn't necessarily have to fully replicate everything that happens in the men's game, I think it could be a boon.
In the women's game, MCOs are pretty new and include Michelle Kang's Kiniska, Victoire Kojevina-Renal's Mercury 13 and the recently announced 6th Street. There are others forming too. One thing that surely everyone can agree on is that the current model of subsidies from big clubs is neither sustainable or desirable. As a reminder, the business model in men's football results in 85% of all league clubs running at a loss and around 50% of all revenue accounted for by the big 6 Premier League clubs. These figures from a 2024 report from LCP are typical of all such research that tells us the head of men's football left the body years ago.
It's difficult. How do you create a sustainable financial model? You know, how do you make sure that you've got a salary floor? So you're not asking young women to play for pittance. Equally, how do you create a salary top? Oh boy, I mean, you know, I could be executed in the Tower of London for that question. I mean, how do you create a sustainable future? Because otherwise what'll happen is what happens in the men's game.
I think the game has so much further it can go with the right support and the right backing, but it's about finding the right balance as to, it's not just about chucking millions at it. That's not going to work. We've seen failed leagues over in the US do that. It's got to be sustainable. It's got to be organic. It can't just be like, I'm at Watford, we get a big new owner that's a billionaire, oil money, whatever you want to call it. They'll chuck some money into the women's team and then think, do you know what, actually, that's not bringing us back anything. Let's get rid of the women's team. You've got to have that sort of support from your club, but you also need to be able to generate your own streams of income, your own commercial deals, your own player sales, whatever it might be, where you can say, look, we're standing on our own 2 feet. We need your support and we need your brand and your name to help put us out there to then bring in that revenue. It's about the women's game trying to stand on its own 2 feet, not be compared to the men's game. These things can run alongside each other without being in competition with each other.
And there is a role for government too in helping to create a growth environment for the women's game. In the States, the Education Amendments Bill of 1972 included something called Title IX. It made illegal sex-based discrimination in any school or any other education program that received any funding from the federal government. Basically, from that point on, schools and colleges had to, by law, offer equal participation opportunities on its programs for girls and boys. Pre-Title IX, around just 7% of high school athletes were female. Now, the number is in excess of 40%. The effects on women's football in the States are plain to see. Here's Jenny Haskell and Yvonne Harrison.
Where there has to be equal scholarships and other aspects to it as well. That development pathway already set where the college system, it really offered that competitive pathway. So you had kind of these major universities that were at highest level of talent that then prepared you for the professional leagues. So for example, you know, while I had the 99ers, I also had, you know, University of North Carolina sweatshirts and this and that because they had been so successful and some of my favorite players played there. And so when I started to go through the college process, you know, you look here, you talk to coaches, and I think that really influences the player development pathway. So, for example, I had college coaches looking at me since I was looking at my game since I was in 8th grade. So that was when I was 14 years old, trying to decide where I wanted to go to university and make that really important decision. You have to compete at the highest level from 14 years old.
We saw, for example, with the broader sports public funding, the UK Code of Governance for Sport, there were targets. If people did not meet their targets, they did not receive their funding. And it didn't happen overnight, you know, so there is a process here. But actually what that created was change and positive change for sport that were in receipt of public funding. So I think there is an element of stick required in order to create progress because progress is too slow.
Given the very different culture of the women's game worldwide, its core meaning and its opportunity to innovate, I put one final question to my guests. Is FIFA fit for purpose for the women's game? Paul Dreisbach, who's worked in women's football in Africa, thinks there's big room for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, and I would like to see more female leadership driving this change too, from the top down. I mean, there are some good female leaders within FIFA and heads of women's football, but like having them show up on the ground and see like, okay, what's actually happening? This is the priority. This is how we're going to build it. This is how we're unique. I don't think that's ever happened in Cameroon.
As I think I've mentioned before, I'm an optimist, but also a realist. So, could there ever be a new, standalone women's world football organisation that replaces FIFA? MOYA DODD was one of the first women ever on the FIFA Executive Committee, and SADIA SHEIKH is at DIYA FC in Pakistan, building women's football out of the dust.
People have thought about that a lot. It's not something that the current structure would contemplate or permit. There would have to be very significant changes to the sort of statutory construct of the international governing body for that to occur. And I'm not sure that the predominantly male constituency of FIFA or any national member federation for that matter would vote for it. Now, I mean, FIFA's not unusual in this regard. I think this is how most international sporting federations work. But it is a very powerful form of centralised control, which makes the power of governing bodies essentially self-reinforcing.
I think at least we will be able to speak our heart out more. Secondly, it will be a women organization which will be by the women, for the women, of the women. We need it. We desperately need it. Especially in Asian countries where I live. And I have become frustrated so many times. It will be easier to talk and I believe in one thing, where women are concerned, all of us go through the same, but in our own case-wise. All of us are strugglers. All of us are fighters. And all of us are change makers. If we come together, we will be fighting for something positive rather than the seat or the government or money. Because we women should support each other. We should be a chain which is unbreakable and always there. It can do wonders. Not only for football, but for a lot of other things.
You see, FIFA feels very top-down to me, and obviously male-dominated at the top. Of course, everyone sees the need and has a desire to generate huge revenues, and with the barriers removed, I have no doubt that will happen. But can those revenues be ethically generated, and what happens with those revenues, and also all the new knowledge created? This, I sense, is where the big difference lies. A global women's football organisation would be one that is based on collaboration, on humanistic principles, on elevating the basic life chances of its participants, of sharing. In short, it would be a sisterhood, the international sisterhood of football.
Money is enormously important, but it mustn't drive your vision. Your vision's got to be driven by your ideals, your beliefs, your philosophy, and what you're trying to do. And, we have to remember what we're trying to do here. And what we're trying to do here is bigger than football. I know that might sound grand, but it's bigger than football. Football is the vehicle, but we want girls. I talked to a group of head teachers 3 weeks ago, and during the coffee break, I said to them, what's the biggest problem in school right now? Gender inequality. What do you mean? The girls are being treated really badly by the boys. This is secondary school head teachers telling me that's their biggest problem in their schools, the behaviour of boys to girls. How are we living in this century? And that is a problem. That cannot be what we were ever, that's what people like me have fought their lives to change. So, why are we still there? And can football, this great vehicle of men's sort of, sporting national game, can we change the record? Can we make it a game which is equally desirable for girls to play, which is equally resourced for girls, which is equally profiled like the men's game? And I don't see why we can't. But you try persuading the broadcasters, or you try persuading people that this is something of greater value than simply how many boxes you've sold into a home. It's really hard. But I genuinely believe that we have to set a model which is about a collective which can achieve more than individuals on their own. And that is That's a very kind of female approach to things, I'm sure people would say, and it might be a bit idealistic, people would say, but I believe what changed the dial for us in the Olympic and Paralympic movements was not, everybody wants to say it was money. No, it was not about money. I know everybody told me it was. It was not about money. It was about creating a sense of collective. It was about saying, if you're really brilliant cycling, I want you to go and help synchronized swimming. If you're really brilliant rowing, I want you to go and help. Because when we got to that point of collective work, everybody got better. Not just the people at the bottom, everybody got better. That isn't how professional sport thinks. It's about self. If we've got to create a sense of collective purpose.
We have to support each other. That's really key. Different organisations and federations need to help uplift each other. It's a competition, of course it is, but I think also you've got to help. If you want your side to go big and go better, you can't do that on your own. So you need to help those. And again, it's that bridging that gap all the time. One thing you shooting off up there, but if you're up there on your own, you're not competing against anyone. You're not getting anywhere. So you might as well help everybody else keep up with you as well.
We women, let's make a huge group of women. Let's do something on our own way where sports is concerned. But they don't want to. I don't know what's in their mind. Maybe they've been brought up in a society where they are scared and the male was always above, looking after them. Sometimes it is very frustrating for me. Not mentoring girls as you should. And you should. And you can.
As the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. If you've been listening to this series, chances are you don't want things to go wrong. Whether the game flourishes or becomes just a spare rib of the men's game is down to all of us. As ever, Moya Dodd puts it rather well.
Those questions that you get asked by your daughter as she grows up from a little girl into a young adult, it's like, why are there no girls when she's watching the Tour de France? Or why is this, why is that? And, it's hard to answer those questions because there is no answer. It's just that's how it is. And then sooner or later, somebody comes along and says, well, I don't accept that answer. I'm going to do what I can to change it. And I'll do what I can within my circle of influence, whatever that may be. I mean, I had a crack at changing some things in FIFA. You've had a crack at changing things in Lewis. I mean, this is how change happens. It doesn't necessarily happen quickly, but it happens because people go, well, why are we doing it that way? You can look at history. Sometimes things happen that way for hundreds of years and then all of a sudden they don't. Look at slavery. It happened that way for hundreds of years. And then maybe not all of a sudden, but, eventually people are like, well, no, that's not okay. And also we're going to not do it. The world does change and it's people who change it. It's people and movements and new ideas and people who can imagine a different future.
I've had the pleasure of meeting so many new people in the making of this series and some old friends too. I hope you've enjoyed listening to all of my guests on this worldwide whistle-stop tour of women's football. I'll be honest, I didn't spend enough time in some places like pioneering markets of the United States or football fanatical South America. My efforts to secure guests there were less successful. Hopefully, I'll get to do some more interviews at some point. One thing I will be doing is, over the next few months, releasing the full 1-hour video version of the individual interviews I did for this series, so keep an eye out for them. Here's a fact about women's football you definitely already know. Women's football is incredibly resilient. It's had to be. It is unstoppable. Don't take that from me. Take it from Moya Dodd.
I'm always optimistic, I guess, because I see where the game has come from and you just can't kill it off. I mean, honestly, if you thought, I've got a great idea, I'm going to try and kill women's football forever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refuse access to fields in, the main sort of cauldron of development in, the northeast of England in that post-World War I period. I'm going to ban it, ban women from using the fields and the facilities. I'm going to make it culturally a taboo for women to play a man's sport. I'm going to have crowds that shout outrageous things and are misogynist and homophobic and sexist and racist and whatever. I'm going to get all that done, make it a really obnoxious place for women to hang around so that they can't easily watch it. I'm going to arrange for girls or women who choose to play it to be treated with a kind of homophobic disdain by the rest of the world. I'm going to make sure that the media don't cover it or give it any good airtime. I'm going to make sure that the international governing body, when it's finally forced to run tournaments for women, doesn't treat it as a commercial asset or give it any status or regard as a valuable set of rights. I'm going to arrange for those rights to be bundled in for free with men's football until 2023, which is the first time that I'll be making those rights available on an unbundled basis. So that will therefore not only set the perceived value of women's football at zero, but it will actually inflate the perceived value of men's football because you're getting, a burger with fries, and that's inflating the price of the burger because you're getting these so-called free fries with it. Amid all of that, I will then ensure that misogyny can reign even at the level of coercion and abuse amongst players who've got no access to remedy when they are subjected to abuse in their footballing lives. All of that actually happened, and yet here we are.
The women's game, I think, is at a fork in the road. One way leads to the same outcomes as men's football, the heavily loss-making one where elite clubs operate in their own economy. Of course, there are many wonderful things about the men's game too, but the thing is, we've already got that version of football, and there's a whole swathe of the global population that it just doesn't connect with. The other road, the one less travelled by so far, leads somewhere very new and pretty exciting. And the road we follow, that will make all the difference. By assembling 23 different powerful voices in one place, I really wanted to get the strongest possible sense of where the women's game is at and how to build the road ahead. Having heard so many perspectives from people within the game and based on my own experiences, here are the conclusions that I've personally come to. That though there is a top rank of players now finally getting their deserved rewards, the majority are not. Many feel unrepresented and left to fend for themselves in substandard and sometimes downright unsafe environments, because that is their reality. Secondly, that the collaborative DNA of women's football, of women, is not reflected in the distribution of the fruits of success, nor in the governance structures that are already seeming to mimic the men's game, where the powerful set the rules. And thirdly, that the whole purpose and direction of the game needs to be set by the widest possible range of voices across the game in every type of job and at every level. Consultation to date has felt too limited. These three main takeouts are set in an overall context of fast growth that itself also has downsides, particularly for those clubs and players not at the elite level. So, I'd like to propose the beginnings of some solutions for each of these three concerns. For player representation and welfare, the message from many guests has been, make this the priority in the game, the thing by which we measure progress above everything else. I agree with this, not only because the players are the heart of the game, but for two other specific reasons too. One, women are treated badly throughout society and the world. Let's change that in women's football. And two, football is many men's religion. They take note of what happens in it. So, by demonstrating what respect and care should look like for women as footballers, the message will not be lost in wider society. As someone once said, be the change you want to see in the world. All those players who are not full-time professionals so can't get union representation need representation. They need their own unprofessional players association funded as a priority out of the new revenues the game is generating. At club level, licenses could, first and foremost, prioritise player welfare over and above, for example, extra turnstiles or brighter floodlights. And an anonymised annual survey direct to all players at all levels to hear all the concerns, so the issues can be tackled before they lead to harm. My second suggestion for you to debate or tear apart is to create a place where collaboration can happen directly between clubs, development organisations, practitioners and sponsors without having to go via overbearing central authorities. A marketplace for new projects, a decentralised network for ideas. Perhaps clubs in different continents connect, find a sponsor and some practitioners and create a project to help young girls who can't afford boots. Perhaps some clubs at different development stages get together to share experience and pitfalls. Perhaps where philanthropists offer funds for female health projects via football, and so on. A joined-up international sisterhood of football. If FIFA can't be reformed or replaced, a kind of shadow FIFA for women's football based on positivity and transparency. Who's in? Finally, the third of the areas of concern is the very purpose and direction of the game. In England, I would love to see football assemblies independently run that facilitate the widest possible dialogue, setting an overall purpose and direction that everyone then feels invested in, but within which leagues and clubs set their own strategies. As this series comes to an end, there's one quote I just can't get out of my head. It's the one from Sue Campbell. We don't want the head to leave the body and leave the rest behind. But what I've heard is that the head is already living at another address from the body, and as things stand, it's not coming back. And that applies to development differences between countries too. That's really why I set out on this year-long project to listen to so many great voices from around the game. How can we end up with a women's game that truly reflects the feminine rather than the masculine? Collaboration alongside competition, connection over isolation. Football is a game of opinions. You've heard 23 different opinions, and mine too. But the final word of the series goes to SADIA SHEIKH, building women and girls football in the right way, but with meagre resources. Many people ask her, what keeps her going?
You know, sometimes I also get tired of fighting for the same things, fighting for the rights. You know, these people, maybe they don't understand. For them, football is a way of earning money, earning fame. And for me, football is about changing lives. When I see a girl getting a job, or the mother and father thanking me, and a lot of things what I told you being turned into positive, then I say, no, let's give it another year. Yeah, so then this thing comes, oh, you are always fighting for females. I said, yes, somebody has to. If I won't, who will?
Not Small Men is a Good Intent Media production.